On behalf of RZIM Canada and INTRICITI, welcome to Reimagine, an opportunity to explore life's new questions. As a means of introduction, my name is Alana Walker-Carpenter, and I will be your host. Whether you have a little faith, a lot of faith, or no faith at all, we hope that this will be a safe landing ground for you to be able to explore identity through the lens of crisis. For those of you who are engaged on social media, our hashtag is Reimagine 2020. That's Reimagine 2020. We hope to have a robust conversation where we're able to engage in a live Q&A. For those of you who would like to ask a question today, simply click on the right-hand side of your screen and those questions will come directly to us. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce you to our RZIM speaker, Max Jeganathan, who is the Asia Pacific Regional Director for RZIM. In his role, he speaks and debates with business leaders, political leaders, and community leaders. Prior to being with RZIM, Max served within a litigation law firm, and after that, had the opportunity to advise political leaders in Australia. He was educated at the Australian National University and the University of Oxford, and together with his wife, Fiona, they have 2 young children. Welcome, Max.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Our industry leader today is Jason Storsley. Jason is the VP of Fraud Management for RBC, Canada's largest bank. Jason graduated from Simon Fraser University out west with a bachelor's of business administration and has held a variety of roles within RBC since he's graduated, including but not limited to asset management, small business, fraud, as I indicated, direct investing, and we'll have an opportunity to explore those roles a little bit later. Jason is a CFA charter member. He sits on the board of directors for the Scott Mission, and together with his wife, Carolyn, have 2 young boys, Logan and Liam. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Alana. It's great to be here.
So I'm going to begin our session today by posing a question to both of our guests. And then after that, we will transition to Max, who's created a talk specifically on identity for us. And then after his talk, Jason and I will return where we hope to have a robust conversation about identity. So Jason, this first question is for you. At present, you are the head of fraud for RBC. And we all know that the pandemic has led to an increase in individuals stealing others' identity, whether it's personal or corporate. In fact, I've been doing a little bit of research within the Association of Fraud Examiners. And in reading, it indicated to me that they had said that the COVID-19 is the perfect storm for fraud. COVID-19 is the perfect storm for fraud. What can people do, Jason, to protect their own identity right now?
Yeah, thanks, Alana. I think that is a really good opening question because, as we have developed tools and capabilities to protect clients' identity and detect and prevent all sorts of forms of fraud, I think one of the most valuable opportunities I have is to educate the public on things that they can do. If it leaves it to us to detect everything, it can be very one-sided. But if we can involve the public in their security journey and help them protect themselves and they become aware of things they can do, our chances of preventing fraud goes up exponentially. And so there's a couple of really practical things that I would probably mention. The first would be the importance of safe passwords and PINs. So for everybody who is listening right now, don't raise your hand. We don't need to see it. But if you have used your son's name, your daughter's name, your birth date, or your anniversary date as a password, I would suggest to you it's probably not that secure. The password of password123 is the most commonly used password. I would also say not particularly secure. So you want to make sure you are protecting your passwords. You're using a combination of capital letters, lowercase, numbers, and you're not reusing those passwords on different sites. A huge common attack vector is to hack into one area, steal your password from there, and then use it perhaps in your online banking and see if it may be the same password. So you want to make sure you're protecting the uniqueness of your passwords and using them differently. The second tip I would give is really around phishing. Phishing is a common term used in the industry, and it is typically involves an email that goes to you that might seem there'd be some urgency in it. I'm your bank, and I just need to confirm that there's been no unwarranted activity on your account. Here's the link, click here and sign in. Sounds very, very simple, sounds rather urgent. It's a bit concerning that you would get an email like this, that the temptation is to click on that. That link will likely take you to something that looks very much like a familiar website to you, but it won't be. And so when you plug in your user ID and your password, you have just given that to somebody on the other end who can now go into the legitimate site and use it. So be very, very careful. They call that phishing with a PH. Be very, very careful on those emails. If you don't recognize the sender, if you're concerned about the link, do not click on it. And whatever you do not divulge any personal information that would be that you would be being phished for. And then the last tip, and the third I would suggest you be aware of, as we've been seeing much more of it over the last number of months, is scams. This is when you would be called or pursued by somebody who would be convincing you to do something. It may be that you have just lost your job, and you may be more vulnerable to having somebody on the other end said, "I need you to do something for me. I'll send you a check. Here's $10,000. Wire me back 8,000 and keep 2,000 for your troubles." And of course, the check later would bounce and you'd be on the hook for everything. So be careful for job-related scams. Investment type scams is another big one. And then last of those would be romance scams. And we're seeing that much more common, in particular among the elderly, where somebody is pursuing them, really preying on that need for love and acceptance. And many of them, signing over a substantial amount of their life savings and things like that. So be very mindful and aware of the scams that are possible as well. So there's a few practical ways that you can protect yourselves.
Thank you, Jason. So we need to be aware of scams. We need to not click on things that we might think may be for us. And a number of us, including myself, need to immediately go change their passwords and PINs after this call.
Indeed.
Thank you. Max, the next question is for you. Prior to your role at RZIM, you were both a lawyer and a political advisor to some of the world's most influential leaders. My question is this: how did you reconcile representing clients and political leaders when they were not always who they said they were?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Alana. And just to go on from what Jason was saying, the other mistake that I make as a culprit is just putting an exclamation mark on the end of it. I don't think that's enough to warrant sufficient. But look, your question is a very important one because it gets to, I think, something that is at the heart of all people in every aspect of our economy, but particularly working in law and politics for me, seeing, probably the best and the worst of people twisting identity or masquerading in their identity for personal gain. It was very difficult. And I mean, particularly in politics, I think that is often the case. But in law too, I definitely had one client I remember well, who was just not being truthful about the facts, the basis of which formed the foundation on which he wanted to take things forward, as a plaintiff in this case. And so I think the short answer is that I tried to, as best I could, imperfectly, of course, I tried to work on two things. One was building a culture of truth in the organizations where I worked. So in the political party, in the political office there, amongst our team of lawyers and the legal team, the very small legal team that I oversaw, to actually build a culture of truth where authenticity was encouraged and where we just were very comfortable with an objective reference point for truth, including moral truth as well. So we weren't fragmenting ourselves into places where it was okay or endorsed in any way or even permitted to just build our own standards or our own systems of what's okay or what's truthful. So I think striving for cultures of truth at the organizational level was really important for me to survive a lot of that. And the other thing is actually just building models of integrity in our own hearts, for me as an individual. So even when things do break down out there certainly in law firms and certainly in political parties, in all political parties, things aren't going to be perfect all of the time, even if there is a culture of authenticity. The nature of the system is such that often it does bring out the worst in people. And as one of my early mentors said, you just can't expect, if you're going to go into this kind of work to try and make a difference, to try and make the world a better place, you can't expect everyone and everything to work in the way that you want. And you can't expect everyone to meet the standards of, perfection in the context of morality or integrity. And then they would say that the fleas come with the dog. And so in law, just as is the case in politics, just as I'm sure is the case with a lot of Jason's work, working for RBC, the fleas do come with the dog. It doesn't mean that we throw the whole dog out, but we do need to navigate carefully the extent to which those fleas can impact on us and our personal integrity. So we do have to draw moral lines. I think we have to be willing, certainly as political advisors, to speak our minds, speak truth to power, to speak up, even if that means our job might be at risk, for truth. And again, that the which you've built a successful culture of truth will help with that. But I think it really boils down in a very simplistic way to doing what we can to maintain integrity in here and to build cultures of truth and authenticity in our organizations and in our teams.
Thank you, Max. So 2 key takeaways for us. First, corporately, we need to create this culture of truth and model authenticity and vulnerability. And then individually creating integrity in and amongst our own hearts and making sure, nobody can see our hearts, right? So making sure our own hearts are right. And we're modeling our own hearts on what's right and what's true. Max, we know we have so many more nuggets to gain from you, so we are going to transition over to your talk, and then Jason and I look forward to joining you in 10-15 minutes. Over to you, Max.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to join you. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you for tuning in. Many of you will be familiar with one of the all-time classic movies, Citizen Kane. And even if you haven't seen it, I'm sure many of you have heard other people talk about it who have seen it. The movie is an interesting one. The opening scene of the movie is actually the dying breath of Tom Kane, who's the main character in the movie. And with his final word, he says, Rosebud, Rosebud. And it's all very confusing because we don't know anything about this guy. It's the opening scene of the movie. And we just see this multi-billionaire magnate sitting in a chair. And just before he dies, he says the word Rosebud. The only way we even know that he has said it is because his servants and staff overhear it. Apart from them, he's all alone in this enormous mansion. And then the whole movie is a flashback of Tom Kane's life. So the second scene of the movie goes right back to when he's, I think, 7 or 8 years old, and he's playing happily on a little sled in the back garden of his family's home on the snow, and his parents are inside, and it's just like this idyllic picture of joy and security. He's in loving relationship with his parents. And then they call him inside. And what has happened is that gold has been discovered on this Kane family land. And so this family has suddenly gone from being very poor to being multimillionaires overnight. And the reason that they call Tom Kane inside from playing is because he needs to pack his bags because he's being sent away to boarding school because his parents can now afford to give him the best education that anyone could want. And so he goes away, and that marks a turning point in his life. He goes to the best schools, to the best universities. He goes on to buy a newspaper and goes into various industries in which he's enormously successful as an industrialist and a magnate. And so much of his life in the context of achievement and affluence go really, really well. But there's this other track of his life, the relational track of his life and his personal life, which don't go so well. He cheats on his first wife and leaves her for his mistress, and then his mistress then leaves him. And he winds up at the end of his life dying in this enormous mansion, saying the word Rosebud, which no one really understands for pretty much all of the movie. Why do I raise that? I raise it because Tom Kane's life is very much defined in the context of his identity by 2 things that continue to be the primary drivers of our identity today, if we don't think more deeply about it. So if we just kind of go with the flow of what modernity in a cultural and economic and social sense throws at us, we go through life with this idea that our identity is really about our achievement and our levels of affluence. Achievement and affluence. How much we do and achieve, and how much we accumulate through that achievement. And I want to talk a bit about two aspects of achievement and affluence in the context of identity. Because if we are going to continue to put so much weight on these two things, it's worth examining the extent to which they can bear that weight. So I wanted to speak with you briefly about the adequacy of affluence and achievement, and then also about the dependability of affluence and achievement, both in relation to our identity, in relation to how the extent to which they can be relied upon to form a foundation for our identity. So first of all, then, the adequacy of affluence and achievement in forming a foundation for our identity. Well, it's worth noting right off the bat that it hasn't always been this way, where who you are is defined by what you do or how much you accumulate or your level of financial security. So it's worth having a look at how we got to this place where financial wealth and professional success became so important to everyone. Now, before the Industrial Revolutions, the best data that we have suggests that global economic growth tracked at around 0.1% a year, right? So pretty much a rounding error, negligible every year for thousands and thousands of years from the best data that we have. Then after the Industrial Revolutions, and there's different ways of cutting them up, but there's been 3 or 4 rounds of Industrial Revolutions, starting with the printing press and steam power and electricity and the internal combustion engine and so forth. But since those revolutions kicked into gear, global economic growth has gone from 0.1% per year all the way to an average of 4% a year. And of course, many years it's much higher than that, even though things are very different this year, of course, because of the pandemic. But that's still a 40-fold increase. So to be ticking along at 0.1% for 10,000 years, and then to suddenly have a 40-fold increase, there's suddenly an enormous amount of wealth that's suddenly being generated, right? And so it makes sense to think about what that actually means for the human heart and for the human mind and for identity. So that's one side of it. There's just more material, if you like, for materialism to emerge out of, right? The second thing that I think is worth talking about is something that happened around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And it happened through a lot of people and a lot of thinking and a lot of writing, but primarily symbolized through the work of a guy called Edward Bernays that I'm sure many of you are aware of. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he took a lot of the psychological and psychiatric breakthroughs over the late 18th, 19th, and into the early 20th centuries, and he applied them to marketing. And Bernays' idea was basically, he went to all the corporations and he said, hey, you guys have been selling stuff to people based on what you think they need. What you've got to do is get them consuming and buying, not based on need, but based on desire and identity. And from then on, and this was accompanied, of course, by the globalization of the economy, the post-war reconstruction that brought down, the market barriers to financial regulations and all of these things that have made supply, demand, and free markets just flow much more easily in the last 60 or 70 years. He got people thinking about selling goods and services to people based on desire rather than need. And we all live in that paradigm of consumption today, whether we are conscious of it or not. And the only couple of questions I would ask you, if you think that that's not true or you think that you somehow live above it, is to ask you respectfully, how many pairs of feet do you have and how many pairs of shoes do you have? How many t-shirts do you have and how many torsos do you have? And if those answers don't match up, then on some level, you, just like me, are living in a paradigm of consumption that is driven by desire primarily, not just based on need. So we see much more generation of wealth, and then we see this shift in consumption patterns. And the best recent example of that is the iPad, or the invention of the tablet, where Steve Jobs literally just came to us and said, hey, did you know there was this amazing thing that you thought you didn't need, but you do need? And literally just invented a market, as if from nowhere. And now the question is not, do we need iPads or not? The question is, how many tablets have you got? What kind of tablet do you use? How often do you upgrade your tablet? So these are all examples of the fact that we now consume based on desire rather than need. And through all of this, we drifted slowly through modernity into a place where affluence and achievement became deified. There's more wealth around, the psychological drivers are being catered to, and so wealth, achievement, financial success becomes more and more and more important, to the point where Oscar Wilde sums it up beautifully when he says, "The God of this generation is wealth. To succeed, you must have wealth. At any cost, you must have wealth." Penetrating insights from, around the middle of the 20th century from Oscar Wilde. The problem, of course, even though what Oscar Wilde says is true of so much of life even today, is that we know deep down, and when we look at the data around us, that financial affluence and professional achievement, while they are still the drivers of success, they don't seem to be enough to give us the fulfillment and the flourishing that we are looking for. They don't seem to be enough for us to ground our identity and build our identity on them. Now, there's another old movie, not quite as old as Citizen Kane, but called Cool Runnings from about 20 years ago. It tells this true story, the amazing story of a Jamaican bobsled team, one of my favorite movies growing up. And in this movie, the Jamaican bobsled team makes it to the finals of the Olympic medal, the Winter Olympic medals. And I think this is actually set in Calgary, right? I can't remember which Winter Olympics it was, but it's in Canada. And they turn up, and the night before the final medal run, Doris Bannock, who's the driver, is speaking to the coach, who's played by John Candy. And he's just talking about how much he wants to win a gold medal. And he knows that John Candy has previously won a gold medal in the Olympics when he was younger. And John Candy says this amazing line. He says, "Doris, a gold medal is a wonderful thing, but if you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. A gold medal is a wonderful thing, but if you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it." And when we look at the accumulation of wealth and achievement across the world today, particularly in developed countries like ours, I wonder sometimes whether perhaps what he says of gold medals applies to achievement and affluence in a material sense. Achievement and affluence, financial security, these are wonderful things. But if we're not enough without them, then maybe we're never going to be enough with them. And when we look at the reality of that insight, it's fair to say that achievement and affluence in a material sense are inadequate as a foundation on which to build our identity. So the adequacy of affluence and achievement are called into question when we look at the data and we look at how we got here. What about the dependability of affluence and achievement? How dependable are these things? Well, interestingly, Nicholas Nassim Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan, which refers to this term that's used a lot in economics and the social sciences to talk about events that we don't see coming. And we can talk about 9/11 or the dot-com crash or the global financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9, or, of course, the pandemic we're living through right now. All of these things are black swans. They're often referred to as events that we didn't see coming. But when we look just through the last 15, 20 years, it seems like black swans are getting more and more and more common. In fact, almost every swan now is black. Around every corner, there seems to be a black swan. Now, I grew up in a little city in Australia called Perth, and weirdly in Perth, all the swans are black. We don't have white swans in Perth. And so growing up, studying economics and political philosophy and learning about this term black swan really confused me. And it wasn't until I entered the workforce that I realized that in the parts of the world where this scholarship was being led, all the swans were white, whether it was, the UK or the US or Canada or continental Europe. All the primary color of swans up there is white. But today, if we're being honest with ourselves, it seems like the Perth paradigm of swan is far more common than the North Atlantic paradigm of swan because there are far more black swans. In fact, the instability and uncertainty in our systems, typified by the pandemic itself that we're living through right now, shows that all of the systems on which we have sought to build our achievement and our affluence and our identities are all intrinsically vulnerable and volatile. And so if we try to build something as important as our sense of who we are on systems that are intrinsically vulnerable and subject to these black swans, then our identities are going to be equally as vulnerable as the systems on which we attach them to. And Walt Whitman, the great poet, recognized this, and he wrote, "When I peruse the conquered fame of heroes and the victory of mighty generals, I do not envy the heroes, nor the president in his presidency, nor do I envy the rich man in his great house." Now, Whitman's insight, I think, is most powerful at the front end when he says, "When I peruse the conquered fame." And his point is this, that no matter how well we do in this world, or what we achieve or what we accumulate, all our fame here is going to be conquered, either by a recession or by a pandemic or by a medical diagnosis or by a political revolution or an economic shift, or ultimately by time and death itself. All fame in this world is going to be conquered. And so it's not dependable. Anything in this world is not dependable enough for our identities to be built on. Now, funnily enough, 1,800 years before Walt Whitman wrote those words, someone else even more famously said, "Do not store up for yourself treasures here on earth, where moth and rust consume and thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourself instead treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not consume and thieves do not break in and steal." Those are the words, of course, of Jesus Christ. Fascinating how 1,800 years apart, the words of a poet and of Jesus Christ resonate, making the exact same insight, with industrial revolutions in the middle and so much social and economic and anthropological change, getting to the same point, the same truth, that the things inside this world are intrinsically temporary, vulnerable, and volatile. And so if we attach our identity to them, then we are at risk, and our identities are at risk. So we see then that identity fails us in its adequacy as a foundation for identity, and it fails us in its dependability as a foundation for our identity. So where does that leave us? It all seems like a bit of a dark picture. Now, fascinatingly, at the end of Citizen Kane, and I'm so sorry I'm going to spoil it if you haven't watched it, you've had almost 100 years to watch it, so I'm only going to apologize once for that. But it gets to the end of the movie, and we still don't know what Rosebud means. And then the final scene, just before the credits roll, are just Tom Kane's staff throwing his possessions into a huge furnace. They're just destroying everything because he has no family. And the last thing to get thrown in is the little sled that he was playing on when he was 7 years old. And the camera zooms in with the final scene of the movie, and you can see the name of the sled on a tiny little plaque, and it says it right there, Rosebud. Rosebud. Tom Kane realized something at the end of his life that he never really understood throughout his life. That true, authentic, stable identity doesn't come from achievement and affluence. It comes from relationship. And he pivots back to the last time that he felt security and affirmation and significance and assurance and meaning and purpose in his relationship with his mother and father. That was the last time he remembered that. And so it's fascinating to me today when I look around the world, and I think that that truth still applies. In fact, there was a Harvard longitudinal study that confirmed that the only correlate, they followed about 10,000 people, I think, for 75 years, and the only correlate they could find for success and flourishing in life was relationships, the quality and authenticity of relationships. And so it's equally fascinating to me when we look when Jesus was asked the question, where do we find identity? He was asked it in the form of an instructional question. What should I do? What's the greatest commandment? Where do I find meaning and identity? And he gives two categories of relationship. He says, go and love God and go and love each other. So in the words of Jesus himself, he actually says, your identity is fundamentally found in the way in which you respond to your call to invest in these two categories of relationship, your relationship with God and your relationship with one another. I find that fascinating when I look at the data out there and when I look also at the data in here in my own heart, that identity needs to be built from relationship, which gives us a much clearer insight and understanding into who we are than what we achieve or what we accumulate. Thanks so much for giving me a hearing. Look forward to discussing this and taking your questions along with Jason as well.
Oh, thank you, Max. You've taken us on a real journey, and I have a second action item: passwords and watch Citizen Kane. But one thing I don't have to do is I don't have to clean out my closet, because I'm super proud to say I only have 9 pairs of shoes, which is anomaly for a woman.
Well, that's pretty good.
Back to Tom Kane. I just cannot help but think about him and think about the Tom Kanes that we have in our lives. And for many of you listening, you are Tom Kane. And maybe this pandemic has been God's pause button for you to think clearly about relationships with family, with colleagues, with friends, and perhaps for some of you, a relationship with God. So I'm going to turn this over to more of a dialogue and conversation. And I'm looking forward to continuing to lean in and to listen to both Jason and to Max and to gain on their insights. So Jason, as I mentioned, we are in the midst of a pandemic. There have been many that have lost their jobs globally. Some, they have been temporary. Others, they are permanent, and people are simply scrambling. How can we move ourselves beyond a title that only has a temporary status?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And I think that this period of COVID has really caused, many people to do soul searching on a whole variety and host of levels. It is easy, very easy actually, to get wrapped up with our identity and wrap our identity up in what we do, because it's so measurable. It's weekly or daily, we can measure results of what we do. Were we productive? Did we achieve something? We can be, as a very goal-oriented culture, Max referenced, post-industrial revolution, GDP growing at such huge levels. I mean, we set these targets. And so we get so wrapped up in what we're doing and how we measure success. And I think it's been a real eye-opening time, I think, for folks to recognize that, we've got to be more than the sum of our successes or our failures. That's a very precarious place to base one's identity, because it can change so quickly. And we've been reminded in this past season of how quickly that can change. Things that seemed incredibly secure became very insecure, and the bottoms fell through on so many different things. And it'll be some time before some of these areas recover. And so, we've got to think more about defining our identity, I think, in who we are as people, as opposed to what we do. What is it that we're serving? What really is important? What will we carry forward with us? What is it that we want to be remembered for? What do we want to have others think of us? What is our brand? That's so much of that is wrapped up into identity as well. And so I think, very much back to what Max was saying around, it is very much about relationships. The closeness of family, the closeness of friends, the closeness of faith is certainly something that's carried me through these past times and through the twists and turns that I've seen certainly over the course of my career. But it is looking well beyond what we do as wrapping ourselves on it and that sort of an identity, and more who we are as individuals, and the authenticity of who we are as well.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
So, who we are, what is it that we want to be remembered for? Max, this next question is for you. You are deeply passionate about the whole concept of identity. And I'm wondering where this stems from. I'm aware that you were a refugee family. You came from Sri Lanka, moved to Australia. How has this journey helped or hindered your passion for identity?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Alana. It's a great opportunity to just share a little bit, I guess, about how I've made sense of this concept growing up. Because I think as a refugee, your identity can very quickly become about what happens to you. And even, that can go in a bad way if it becomes a place of victimhood, where you just play the victim. But it can go the other way too, where, even the things that you overcome as a refugee suddenly become, your entire kind of objective reference point for who you are. And I think there are dangers with both of those things, but certainly for me, being a refugee and growing up in Australia, literally getting a second chance at life, and seeing my parents, work hard and just give of themselves so much for one another and for me and for our extended family, and seeing them literally build up from nothing. I think that showed me a lot in the context of character and character traits and work ethic and those sorts of things. But really what it came down to for me, and it didn't happen until I was a teenager, was that I was still a bit confused about whether identity was more about what happened to you, or was it more about what you did to overcome what happened to you, or was it about, as Jason and I have already touched on, achievement rather than what you actually are. And so for me, it really did become a journey of faith. So my journey of identity correlated completely with my journey of faith and in becoming a Christian, because the message is ontologically grounded, which is a hugely powerful and controversial and unique reality, I think. Because so much of who we are in the world is determined by what we think or feel or say or do or achieve. Whereas the Christian message says that, no, who you are actually begins, your identity actually begins with who you are, not what you think or feel or say or do. And that is fundamentally determined by your relationship to God, which then flows out into your relationship with other people. And so for me, that did exactly what achievement and affluence and experience could never do. So the inadequacy of achievement and affluence that I talked about, the lack of dependability of achievement and affluence that I talked about, a relationship with God for me actually provided all of that certainty. It anchored me to something that transcended this world, that transcended, the pandemic, that transcended the civil crisis through which we left Sri Lanka, transcended the economic struggles of my family as I grew up. It actually literally was an anchor outside of the storm, if you like. And that's where the safety and the assurance, I think, which is what, Tom Kane's story really comes back to in the end. It's where can you find that comfort and that assurance and that affirmation of who you are that has nothing to do with what you do. And then, of course, the flip side of that, which is the other side of the coin, where it's not that what we do and feel and think and say don't matter, but if we can establish who we are first, then all of those things flow very naturally from that. And I think this is the big distinction that it took me 15 to 20 years of life to work out. The world out there tells us that achievement precedes identity. So you achieve first in order to build your identity. But the reality is that identity precedes achievement. So we need to work out who we are first and who, where we relate to and how we relate to this creator of ours, in my view. And then achievement flows very naturally from that. And what we are called to and what we do with our lives flow from that.
Thank you, Max. And I can't help but think we all need that anchor within the storm of COVID. We all need that anchor. Jason, this next question is for you. You have held many prestigious roles within RBC across the board. We spoke with them when I introduced you. Yet you are not defined by the titles in which you bear. You are not defined by those. Your identity is driven from somewhere else. Describe to us, in fact, where your identity lies and why.
Yeah, sure. So, just picking up on what Max was saying as well. I mean, I've been through all sorts of different twists and turns throughout life. It's been now about, going on 25 plus years in corporate life and a variety of different roles at a couple of different financial institutions. And, there were those periods of time where I felt in many times that my identity was actually being stolen from me because I was believing that I was as good as what I was achieving. And there was nothing lasting or sustaining about that. And, I've had those periods where I've gone back and now, very much dependent on my faith and more in the faith of the person of Jesus Christ and what he's done for me as opposed to what I've done for myself. And so there are mixed messages. You will hear from, many people in the world and society that you are as good as what you have accomplished. And there are ups and downs in that. But there is something that's very peaceful and very hopeful about understanding that your identity actually comes from what Christ has already done for you. And so I focus on my identity and messages that I'm told that the Bible would tell me about, that I've been chosen by God. It would tell me that I'm forgiven. It would tell me that I have been lavished with grace and mercy. It would tell me that I am adopted as a child of God. None of this has anything to do with what I've achieved. I've earned none of this. This is all based on what Christ has done for me. And those things are unchanging. They're not dependent on circumstances, be they good circumstances or bad. And so it's particularly comforting, and it's easy to forget this as we get caught up in our achievements. And I'm about as type A as they come. So I know my areas of vulnerability and areas of my life that I need to keep in check. But it's comforting to know, as achievement oriented as I am, that if I never achieved another thing in my life, I would not be loved any less, because it was never about what I achieved to begin with. And so it's about, believing that, receiving that, accepting that. And there's just a huge amount of comfort and peace, knowing that identity and that eternal identity is secure and it can't be compromised because it was never me that caused it or created it in the beginning. It was done on a whole other level by a much higher power. And so that would be kind of where I draw my identity and my comfort and my peace from.
Thank you, Jason. Those words really resonated with me. A couple of years ago, I was recovering from a head injury and really couldn't do anything. And I felt so stripped of my identity as a wife, a mother, a daughter, a business leader, a neighbor, a colleague. And I remember sitting in our living room and having one of those God moments. And I heard this little whisper, Alana, if you were to never do another thing for me, I would love you just the same. Yeah. I would love you just the same. Max, this last and final question is for you. You and Jason and I both have young children who we care for passionately. So what, if anything, can we do for our children, our grandchildren, that next generation of leaders to help them not define themselves against worldly things?
Such an important question, and I'm just so encouraged by both Jason's last answer and your sharing just now. I think that's just sums it all up beautifully. And so I think it's really about taking the two realizations that you guys have just shared, and really instilling those in the hearts and minds of our children and of the next generation of leadership. We talk about intergenerational wisdom transfer as if it's like some technocratic transaction that we can just write books about. And if we get the education systems right and we get the MBA curricula correctly and we just, feed these kids what they need to know, then that'll be enough. Whereas I think we've missed the importance of relational education and moral education and focused entirely on technocratic education, which isn't completely useless and has its place. But I think we need to teach children that there is objective moral truth. We need to give them objective reference points for their identity and for what's right and what's wrong. And we have to be very careful in, elevating and deifying feelings. I think the post-truth culture correctly acknowledges that feelings are important, but just goes way too far. And it says that feelings are all that matter. So I think raising kids who are well-balanced, as C.S. Lewis says, we don't want to raise a generation of people without chests, without objective frames of reference, objective reference points through which they can navigate through life. We want to model for us, for Christians like myself and Jason and you, Alana, the love of Jesus, in the lives of our children, to show them that, what matters most about who we are is whose we are rather than actually what we do. The fact that we belong to God, that they do as well, that they are unconditionally loved, but also that unconditional love is not unconditionally affirming. That the Christian model of love protects that which it loves. And so necessarily that requires a rejection of some things, a rejection of what it deems to be damaging and evil and so forth. So I think a rediscovery of absolute truth, a rediscovery of moral education, and ultimately couching all of that in a doubling down on relational education, on teaching our kids about the unique and intrinsic value of all people, regardless of what they believe and who they are and what they achieve. This Christian message teaches us that we are all made in the image of God. And that's an amazing thing. And, we know our Bible tells us that people aren't just made in the image of God. God literally refers to every single person that he makes as his masterpiece. He calls each of us his masterpiece, and then he calls each of us by name. And if we can get that, I think, into our children, that will give them their rosebud. And they can live in that rosebud every day of their life. It won't be a realization that comes right at the end. It's something that they can have as a means to freedom every single day.
Thank you, Max. I'm just thinking about, what we're teaching our children and what we're teaching that next generation within the context of the boardroom. And I think about the importance of that relational education. How do we relate with one another? And it really does come back to what you just said, Max. Love, right? Love.
Right.
Max, Jason, our time has come to an end. This has just been such a poignant conversation about where our identity lies. I thank you for being honest and raw and authentic and how you both have shared. For those of you who want to continue the dialogue, please feel free to go to www.rzim.ca or www.intriciti.ca. Next week, we are delighted to welcome Alicia Wood, an RZIM speaker, and Sonia Salman, founder and of Ebby Rain. She's the founder and chair of Ebby Rain, and we are going to be exploring the topic of justice. And so thank you again, Max and Jason. You know, identity is a journey. We never arrive. We are constantly exploring to get us to that space. And I think we need to give ourselves permission to explore who we are, giving ourselves permission. So my hope for each one of you as we depart this call is that we will all have our rosebud moment. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Alana, for having us.
Thank you, Alana.